comes from. I think it also needs to focus on the challenge that exists, the problem that you're trying to solve as an organization, the challenges that are presented to you today in accomplishing that, and then why you're the solution and why the money that you're trying to raise is helping to advance your mission and to help solve that problem. It's all about presenting you as a problem solver, a change agent, accomplishing things. That's why I say it's so important to focus on the impact that you can make through this particular campaign effort. It's so important to be talking about impact. And then the second piece is you have to answer for people the urgency question. A lot of people that are going to be asked to give to you might be consistent givers, and they give out of routine, but now you're asking them to give something that they weren't expecting to give to, and it's probably an extraordinary gift, and they might want to, but they might also be saying, you know, well, why should I be giving today? Why can't I wait for another 4 or 5 months to give you a decision? So there have to be these triggers that you can create in your campaign that get people to make decisions. And sometimes they are challenge gifts that you set up. And if you can sort of find a donor who's given you a reasonably large gift and you can convince them to sort of call it a matching gift, I would encourage you to do that. So the best case scenario in this $1 million campaign model is to say, well, we know we're going to ask this person for a couple $100,000. Why don't we do this? Why don't, in the course of the conversation, say, you know, what would be really great is if you would make this as a challenge gift and give us 6 months to sort of raise an equivalent amount, and we'll say you'll match dollar for dollar any amount of money that's raised over the next 6 months. Now, internally, I think we'd all know that they would give the gift regardless, but externally, you would present it as having some real teeth. And that helps create some urgency around a campaign that might not have, you know, an obligation placed on the organization for dollars in the door by a particular date. You know, construction projects are great because you can say, we can't engage the architect until we raise 1/4 of the money. We can't break ground until we've raised half the money. We can't you know, put up recognition until we've raised 3/4 of the money, or whatever. You can create some of these great timelines, but there are other campaigns that just don't work that way, and you have to create them. So whatever you do, create that urgency that will get people to make a decision quickly. And the case for support, despite people's confusion, is not the brochure. Okay? The case for support is really an internal document, and it's meant to be the single source of communication and talking points for a campaign. So the challenge I often see is that everyone's talking about the campaign differently, or has a different rationale for why the organization is conducting the campaign. And you want to get everybody on the same page. You know, some people say you need to hear something 57 times before you believe it. Well, I don't know how many times is accurate, but you need to hear it a lot. And if you're hearing different things at different times from different people, it doesn't all come together. But if you hear the same thing repeated several times by different people, the light bulb will hopefully go on. So this is a source document. It's a source document for your leadership, but it's also the source document to create proposals, to create brochures, to create request letters, invitations. It's meant to sort of have the language right there that you can borrow for everything that you can possibly need. So the case is really a vital document. And here it is. You have the key elements listed for you. This is basically the headings that I would consider if I was drafting one from scratch. And you can come up with fancy names for the different headings, but you know, these are the things that you want to be sure to communicate in your case. So in terms of the campaign plan, these are the elements that you must address. You must address a timeline. How long are you giving yourself to raise a certain amount of money? And for smaller campaigns, it could be anywhere from 6 months to 12 months on average. There aren't that many campaigns that you want to go on beyond 18 months. And one of the main reasons reasons is you want volunteers to be engaged, and you want to give them a very finite sense of how long they're going to have to be involved with you. So having in the plan a clear definition around the timeline of the campaign gives everybody a clear sense of how long they're going to have to commit to this particular project. It also allows you to establish really important goals and benchmarks, because remember, every month you're going to have to be throwing up numbers. And if you're trying to raise, let's say, $1 million over 12 months, you can do the math. I can't, but it's like $80-something thousand, right, a month, right? That's how much you have to raise every month to be successful. And if you've raised zero over the first 4 months, you got a lot of catching up to do. So it's really important to be able to establish the timelines, to establish the benchmarks. We talked about the table of gifts. The phasing is interesting because in a smaller campaign, you might not have phasing. You might just have one phase, which is our gifts of $5,000 and above. Let's go out and let's ask. And that's fine. It's just one major gifts phase. A lot of campaigns, though, they start out with sort of planning, and then they have the organization and recruitment, where you pull together all of your volunteers. Then they would have the leadership gifts phase, and the major gifts phase, and the community phase. That's probably not relevant in this particular scenario, because unless you have multiple constituencies that you have to address at different times. So you might, for example, have a board phase. Let's start with our board. Let's focus inside out, top down. Let's focus on the board for a month, get all those gifts, and let's go to our volunteers, and then let's go to our best prospects, and then that's fine and understandable. But probably it's just going to be a list, and you just hit it as hard as you can and try to make progress against that list every day. So it's something to really think about there in terms of phasing. The organizational structure, it's going to be pretty basic. You're going to have your board, and then you're probably going to have some committee. And if it gets too big, it becomes unmanageable. What has to happen is that the whatever volunteers that you have to be staffed pretty well. They have to be told what to do. And so you have to have those resources. So the more committees you have, the more difficult it becomes to manage those volunteers. So you got to keep it simple in these smaller campaigns. And for the Rose Garden project, it's the Rose Council. It's just a special group of people, 8 to 10 individuals who are very supportive of the project, who are giving, and who are willing to go out into the community. So my advice is just keep it super simple. Really focus where you can on making it small and manageable. You also have the donor recognition, which is unique to projects like this, to campaigns like this. In an annual giving program, you might have certain levels for people who give over $100, $1,000, $5,000. And that's wonderful, because in these campaigns, you can build them into those societies. But what people most often expect is extraordinary naming in their campaigns. So what that means is, what are you going to offer the individual that's going to give you $200,000? Normally there is a special recognition opportunity. And in facility projects, it's the naming of something. You might name the building. You might name a room. You might name a hall. But even if it's not a facility project, you've got to think about other opportunities, because oftentimes it can boil down to recognition. No one will say that recognition is the driving force behind their philanthropy, but I will tell you that it oftentimes raises people's sights pretty substantially. And if they have in their mind that they want to honor someone themselves, or a parent, or a grandparent, or a family member, or something, they're going to look at that very carefully, and if it means giving an extra $50,000, they probably will, especially if they have that capacity. So I really emphasize in campaigns the donor recognition menu, the naming opportunities that are available. And no one ever likes to think about policies because they're boring, but they're important too. Is your campaign going to accept estate commitments as part of the totals? Are you willing to accept that piece of land that you can't even find on a map, and you don't know what it looks like, and you don't know if you could ever sell it, or that artwork, or that piece of jewelry, or there are all kinds of things that people try to offer you, and you don't want to just say no, because that seems spiteful and ungrateful. But if you have a policy in place that says, well, that's an interesting question. I'm so grateful for the offer. I need to check with the policy to see if that's something that we can accept. And then you can go back to the policy, and then maybe it says the board has to approve. But unfortunately, our policies prevent us from accepting land, gifts of land for this campaign. So they really are helpful. And then the opportunity, hopefully, is to explore some other type of gift that would allow them to accomplish the same goal. So in terms of the timelines, for campaigns that are small in nature, I mentioned the importance of keeping them pretty short. I mean, UCLA's campaign is going to be 10 years, right? And the advantage they have is that they have this incredible infrastructure, both in staffing but also volunteers. And they see it as okay to have the change in leadership over time within their campaign. But for you, I imagine you're going to want the same people involved with you from start to finish. So you have to make sure that it's somewhat condensed. And I kind of went through some of the different phases that are typical in campaigns: the planning phase, the campaign cabinet phase, where you're doing the recruitment and probably the solicitation of your board. This is probably something you've heard quite frequently, the quiet phase, right? Has anybody heard the quiet phase before? And then there's usually the associated magical percentage that says, well, you're in the quiet phase until you get to 50% or some number like that. What's really fascinating is that the quiet phase is never quiet. It's the worst kept secret, right? And the campaigns that are quiet are the campaigns that are dead, that have no activity. What I'd like to counsel is that when you say quiet, what you really mean is that you're not telling anybody out in the community how much you've raised or what the goal is. You're kind of trying to keep that part a little bit of a secret and a mystery. But you have to tell those people that are on the inside circle, the early people that you're soliciting, your volunteers, your board members, you have to tell them what your goals are and how much you've raised. But the broader community doesn't need to know those two things. And I think it gives you some flexibility around goal setting as well. I mean, if you go out and you try to raise a couple $1 million, and after 3/4 of the timeline, you've only raised a couple $100,000, you don't want to start thinking about, you don't want to be public with that, because it's going to be embarrassing. So being quiet allows you to secure all of your key gifts, talk to all of your real internal stakeholders before then going more broad. I have a lot of organizations that say, yeah, but we're quiet, we can't talk about our project, right? Say, no. You need to be talking about your project. You need to be talking about your plans. You need to be talking about your vision. Just don't tell them how much you need to raise. You can tell them how much the need is, how much the vision is. And it could be $50 million, but don't say you're going to raise $50 million through this campaign. That's where you wait a little bit, a bit of time. And I think every campaign has a little bit of a quiet phase, and some are longer than others. A lot of campaigns won't go public until they're at 90% of goal, because the community phase is not really expected to provide a lot of the money in the campaign. So you have to kind of determine what the right campaign announcement date is for your effort, and it's going to vary. Some are going to be really quick and early because you have great confidence that you can achieve your goal. Others are going to have to wait a little bit until you really figure out what you're going to end up with at the end of the campaign. But I wouldn't necessarily say, as a general rule of thumb, there's no reason to go public with your campaign before you hit 50%. And I think that's where the halfway mark comes in. I think you can wait until you hit 50%. Because I think there's a confidence building factor, that an inspiration, a motivation, a credibility, momentum, all these different things that you derive when you exceed that 50%. For whatever reason in our world, Once you're at 50% of goal, people think you're going to get there the rest of the way. But at 25%, they're like, I don't think they're going to do it. And you know, you could be a month into a 12-month campaign, but if you went public at 25%, you're like, they're not going to make it. I just know. Because they're only 25%, they went public. So it's really challenging in fundraising that perception is often reality. And there's a psychology to all of this that is still a mystery to me. And what we've learned is to not mess too much with the psychology of a donor, to allow them to sort of carry on with these ideas, because it gives them comfort and it allows them to be generous. But the fourth phase here you see is the public campaign. And it's interesting. I think there is some advantage to giving everybody the opportunity to participate in the campaign. There's no reason to only restrict your support in a campaign effort to a small audience. I just want to caution you not to expect the larger group to be the savior in a campaign. So plan for the opportunity provided to the larger public and your larger donor base and prospect base to participate, but just make sure that you have reasonable expectations. And when you do go public, I think it's a perfect opportunity to test different fundraising mechanisms. So there's obviously the sort of the Facebook type campaign efforts that are emerging today. There's all kinds of other electronic giving mechanisms, special online campaigns or email viral campaigns. Those are really effective these days in spreading the message and getting that out there. And so do more than just sending a letter to your prospect base. Try to do a Kickstarter campaign. Try all kinds of different things. Just allow the opportunity for you to grow your awareness. And that's really what it's meant. The public campaign, not meant to raise a lot of money, meant to really get the message out in a big way. And then, you know, celebrate. Always remember to celebrate. So, typical campaign budgets are all over the map. Most of the campaigns that we run that are in the sort of $5 to $15 million range seem to have about a 6 to 8 cent cost ratio. So for every dollar that's raised, it will cost about 7 cents, let's say. Okay? So if you're raising $10 million, it's going to cost you $600,000 to raise that kind of money. Some are much more expensive, and there are good reasons for that. Some campaigns are capacity building type campaigns, so they're adding a lot of staff to be able to accomplish those campaign goals, but then also they're hoping to keep those staff on board long term. A lot of other projects apply a lot of money to marketing, and it's not necessarily done to help raise money, but to raise awareness. Like working with the Santa Barbara Museum of Art right now, and they added in a good 2 to 3% extra on their budget just so that they could hire the resources of a firm to give them guidance on a communications and marketing and public relations campaign. And we said, okay, that's great. You do recognize it's not going to deliver that many extra dollars. They said, yeah, but we're not going to be able to get the budget for this any other way but through the campaign. So we said, great. I think the cost of fundraising is still south of 8%. And that's what happens when you raise $50 million. You can often reduce that cost of fundraising pretty substantially. But my mom, you know, she did a comprehensive campaign for Children's Hospital Los Angeles, raised over $1 billion. Took her about 13 years, but you know, her cost of fundraising, because it was a comprehensive campaign, I think was probably 15 to 18%. Okay, so there's no magic about keeping that number south of 10% or anything like that. I mean, it's always nice to be able to say that you're going to be able to spend 90% of all the money that's raised on the project, but you know, is that any good if you're not investing the sufficient resources to be successful? I think the challenge is that a lot of organizations that are trying to raise smaller amounts of money that have very little budgets to do so don't want to spend anything. Nothing. Like just raise the money. We don't have any money to spend. And that's a bad recipe. I mean, there's got to be some budget, okay? And oftentimes what organizations will do is establish a minimal budget, but then what they'll do is they will, make the budget payable or take out some sort of loan or make a note that's payable out of the funds of the campaign. So you're advancing the campaign money, and that will be repaid out of the proceeds of the campaign. But you have to spend some money. There's definitely money that needs to be spent. I have a slide in the back that we'll get to that'll show some of those different areas where I think you can spend the money. But I really believe that it shouldn't take more than, let's say, 5 cents on the dollar on a $1 million campaign. So to have a $50,000 investment would be more than generous, I think, for a lot of campaigns trying to raise $1 million. Okay? So in terms of leadership, you need people both inside the organization and outside the organization to be successful. We talked about the Rose Council, right? It doesn't take a lot of people, but it does take some people. Because, as I said earlier, you don't want this to be an obligation of merely staff. I mean, anybody that comes to the organization and says, you guys should raise $1 million, like a board or something, and then sort of puts it on staff is really dangerous because the resources just don't exist from staff time to be able to do that. It's a recipe for disaster. I would much prefer for an organization to say, we need to do this. Let's all jump in this together. And as long as the board understands that this is a project that they have, that they're responsible for it, staff will be there to help, but they have to deliver the money. I mean, these campaigns really should be, in a lot of ways, board responsible type campaigns. Staff can be supportive, but the money should come from other sources outside. So I would caution you all to be thinking about that anytime that you're sort of given the assignment to raise an extra $1 million through a campaign. Say, great, I'm happy to support this, but the board has to be there willing to lend their time, lend their resources, and their networks. Typical organizational chart we talked a little bit about. This is a larger campaign that you would see. There are 1,000 different campaign charts, but the simplest of them all, you could do a $10 million campaign with this kind of org chart or larger. Your board of directors, you might establish some very specific group that has no other responsibilities but to make a gift and to help network and introduce. And normally they're attracted because they don't have to come to meetings. They can just be a phone call away. The responsibilities or expectations is really narrow and defined. Like, we want you to show up to 2 events and we want you to make 3 calls. That would be a perfect President's Council kind of member. And usually they're directly reporting to the executive director, let's say. Then you might have your campaign executive committee, which would be your chairs and a couple of board members, maybe the development committee chair, and some other folks who are willing to meet more often and really dig in. Like, some of them will meet every week and just tackle stuff, but they're really digging in and getting their hands dirty. And then they would form the nucleus of a much larger campaign cabinet that would hopefully be representative of all of the different constituents that you hit. By constituents, I mean donor constituents, not sort of clients that you might serve as an organization necessarily. So, in a school, you might have parents, you might have grandparents, you might have alumni, you might have vendors, you might have foundations. You want to make sure that you're capturing all of the different groups that you would be approaching in a campaign. And I don't know what, so give me an organization. What organization do you represent? Sure, or either one.
Make Way for Books.
Make Way for Books. Okay, so your target population, who would you say would be your typical donor to the organization?
Retirees, past librarians, past teachers.
Past librarians, past teachers. Okay, So right there you have three groups that are not insignificant in numbers and probably have a pretty good network from the past or current life. So in my mind, in a cabinet, I would make sure that if we were trying to raise $500,000 or whatever it was in a special effort, that I would have a sort of a chair for each one of those different constituencies. And I would try to have those leaders create a task force or a large group around them to be able to really effectively gather support from those different constituents. And there are probably other constituents that you didn't list that you have as well. But every organization has its unique donors and groups of donors. And I just want to make sure that you have representation from those groups. So it's pretty simple here, even simpler if all you do is you have sort of the Rose Council. But even in the Rose Council example, you're going to have people that are members of the Rose Society, or you're going to have people who just love roses, who are donors to that. You're going to have people who are in the sort of public eye, like government representatives potentially. You're going to have foundation representatives, corporate representatives. So you have lots of different constituencies and perspectives that you need to bring into the different groups. Then we get into the prospect list, and this is where it becomes really fun. In most of these campaigns, everyone's a prospect. Right? I mean, you can't afford to necessarily keep anyone off the prospect list unless they've got no money or they've really signaled to you that they have no interest. So what you're trying to find are people that have great affinity and great capacity. If you think about sort of a chart or a diagram where in the upper right-hand corner there's great affinity, great capacity, that's the ideal. Unfortunately, a lot of people have great affinity and no capacity. And a lot of people have great capacity and no affinity. And you sort of have to figure out who those people are. If they have no capacity, if they can't make a gift, you're not going to waste your time in a fundraising campaign. But if they have great affinity and great capacity, they're on the list. If they have great capacity, they should be on the list. Because you can create affinity. There's lots of ways. Connections with other people. You can bring them into the fabric of the organization through events. You can do lots of things to create the affinity with them. You just might not get the gift in the first month of the campaign. But those are the kinds of people that you want on the list. And your list might be individuals. It might be faith groups. It might be corporations. It might be foundations. It should be all of these different things because they're all potential prospects. Guess who should be on the prospect list too? The board. Every board member has to be on your prospect list. And in theory, every board member should be expected to make a gift. It might not be the largest gift. It might only be a symbolic gift. But if you don't have 100% participation from the board, you're going to be challenged in a lot of ways. First, it shows that there isn't universal consensus about the project. Secondly, it limits you from approaching a lot of foundations who would require that you have 100% board participation. So you have to get through the board, you have to get all of them to give. But think about all of the people that you would want to approach and really put them on that prospect list. And I'll show you a template of a prospect list later before we conclude, so you can kind of see the different information that you're going to need to fill in, like what's the amount that we should be asking for? Who's the person that's best connected with them in the organization? Who should be the point of contact? Who else should be involved in the approach, in the solicitation? What is the key next step that we need to take with them? Is it cultivation? Is it an ask? And then you obviously have the different notes that are important, like this person loves roses, or this person indicated in my conversation with them that they would give $50,000 if we ran a campaign. So tracking all of this stuff in that prospect matrix is critically important. And I think campaigns are designed so that you work from top down and inside out. right? So by inside out, we're talking about the board, and then the volunteers, and then existing donors, and then those that haven't given but should maybe give to your organization. And top down, probably the executive director should be the first person to give, then the board, and then volunteers and such. So you can see how it sort of builds. And ideally, when you're asking all of these insiders to give, you're also asking them to be engaged. You're asking them to be involved. So you can build out the infrastructure that you need in the campaign over time to reach more and more people. You might start out day one, and it's board chair, the executive director, and the development director. You've got a team of 3. Well, the first ask that you make is to another board member, and you ask them for $5,000 and for them to be on the cabinet. And they say no to the cabinet, but yes to the $5,000. The next person, yes for $5,000, they say yes to the $5,000, and they say yes to the cabinet. Well, now you're a team of 4. So you can see how over time, you have more and more people that are engaged and willing to be your sales force. Because campaigns are about building the sales force and having enough people out there asking. So, but you can't just sort of arrive at day one with a sales force. You need to build that, and it takes some time. So pitfalls to avoid. Obviously, coming out with a very leaky case, it sort of begs more questions than it answers, and I've seen it a million times. Like, for example, if you're doing some sort of project to expand your facilities, and maybe you need $1 million to build an additional wing on your headquarters building, something like that is bound to create or generate the question in someone's mind, well, how much more is that going to cost the organization to operate on an annual basis? And if you can't give a good answer to that, then the person is not going to really believe that you've done enough planning or have thought well enough about what you're trying to accomplish to expect or to earn, I guess, a big gift. So one of those key questions always that seems to be forgotten is, how are we planning to pay for this once we build it? Because you're telling me you struggle every year to raise just enough to make ends meet. Now you're going to increase the size of your physical plant. So how do you plan to pay for that? And a lot of projects will build in operating costs for a number of years into their case to demonstrate that, hey, we recognize that this is going to create some additional costs for the organization, and we're going to make that a part of that while our development operation continues to expand and grow. So it's really important to think through some of these considerations before you make your approach. You don't want people to think that you've got big holes in your case. We talked about the lack of unity and leadership among the organization. Poor planning, phases, never-ending campaign, right? I mean, you've got to have that timeline. You've got to stick to it as best you can. You can't just keep people on for years and years and years. Lack of staff attention is important because it really will be important undertaking of staff. There's no way to get around it. I haven't seen many campaigns that have been successful absent staff involvement. The time is far gone where boards and other volunteer groups will just get together and do something and hand you a check. Unfortunately. It happens sometimes, but not very often. So if you can get away with it, by the way, you really should try to position it as, you guys go do it, and send me the check. And if it's small enough, who knows? Maybe they'd be willing to do something like that. But more often than not, it's very much an integrated team effort. And then complacency, like, oh, I can do that tomorrow. No problem. I mean, you can't. You got to do everything that you need to do today. So let me pause there just for a couple of quick questions before I kind of roll through some of the, I think, operational type stuff that you might benefit from in thinking about your own campaign. Any good questions that I can help answer or address at this point in time? Yeah.
So you talked about the feasibility study and how for small nonprofits they're going to be running it themselves. Do you recommend they try to find some neutral source when they go to talk to these people, or do you want them to have their executive director go out and do these?
By neutral source, you mean someone that isn't affiliated with the organization? No. Either you hire a professional to do it, who knows how to do it and do it right, or you have a staff member do it. And you might not get some of the same level of candor that you might get if I were doing the conversation. Like, you know, I get to hear, like, I'm never getting that organization again. I hate that guy. And that happens, right? But that's good advice that we're getting. Got it. Here's what we need to do to get the gift from this person. But I think, absent of that, you want to be able to build a relationship, right? So if you're doing the meeting, if you're taking the time to do that, you're going to have a stronger relationship with that person. You're going to know exactly where they're coming from and how to respond to them and the appropriate next steps. So I would very much think that it would be an exercise that you would want to do internally. Yeah. Any other questions? Please.
I have a question. What if you're dealing with a not so fundraising supportive board?
Perfect. Which is like every board.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of education that's necessary, and I don't have unrealistic expectations of board engagement. I think if there's a commitment by the board to give at various levels, and to give some time, and to be willing to meet with you to explore different opportunities to be helpful, it's probably the best you could hope for. There are very few people on boards who are going to just sign up to go ask. And you know, when you get those kinds of people, you feel really lucky and fortunate, and you run with it. But I would say that the expectation should be that most board members would be great advocates for you, you know, would say the right things and be your best cheerleader, would make a gift, might connect you to some people that they wouldn't necessarily need to ask. But the connection part and and hopefully, though, even if they're not willing to ask, they might be willing to join you in what we call sort of second seat, which is you call the meeting together, you bring us together for lunch, and you can explain why you're involved and why this organization means so much to you. And then I, as the staff person, will take the responsibility of investigating their interest in making an investment in this project. So it's good not to have unreasonable expectations. And oftentimes, if you're raising a significant amount of money through a campaign, the board might say, yeah, but I'm giving my annual gift already. And a lot of board members might say that. So the amount that comes from the board might be very modest for sure. And that's fine. But as long as they're not standing in the way, I think you can be successful. Ideally, they're cheering you on and pushing you on and, you know, making some good connections and headway for you. Anything else? Go ahead, please.
Do you find that those complacent board members kind of step up to the plate when there's a goal in front of them and they have specific tasks? No.
So the question is, do you find that those complacent board members suddenly step forward and get engaged? The reality is no, not often. But I would say too is that there needs to be someone pushing them. You know, board members need to be called on, pushed, kept accountable, and that takes energy and time. So if you have a good board member who you just know is good, chances are that you just need to be pushing the right buttons to get them to do those things. But the board member that you know is not sort of capable in terms of financial capacity, doesn't have a lot of connections, might be a relic of sort of a former administration or previous terms, or recruited not with the expectation to give. You know, I wouldn't say they're hopeless, because I don't know who's going to see this video. But, you know, there's not a lot of optimism on my part that you can suddenly create a great fundraising board member out of them. I think you really need to spend your time where where the grass is greenest, that is where your opportunities are greatest. And, there's the law of thirds, right? And the board is no different. Even with a campaign committee, a third of the people are going to do what you want them to do. A third are just going to show up and sort of be there but absent. And then a third will never even show up, right? So you only have a third to work with normally. And how can you really make the third great? In the case of the Pasadena Conservatory of Music, it was that $6 million campaign example. The goal of the campaign was to, this time, really engage more people and to spread the work around. Because the past campaign was like $1 million, and the same two people were chair and the executive director, and they'd raised all the money. So we said, this time we're going to engage a lot more people. We said, great, we'll do that. So we spent a lot of time with the board, we spent a lot of time building a committee of volunteers, and in the end, it was still the same two people that did all the work. And that's pretty typical of campaigns, small and large. The lion's share of the work rests in a very small number of hands. And so I think the advantages, or the good news, is that you can be successful with not necessarily a robust volunteer core, but it sure does help the more volunteers you can engage in the work. And I was in San Luis Obispo